Hello guys, welcome back to our anime moments. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of upcoming episode of Tales of Herding Gods based on novel. So let's start. The Ministry of Works reconstructed the manufacturing factory in Mill Prefecture while Qin Mu redesigned the Great Furnace. The manufacturing factory looked completely new, and there were new forging machine giants in it. With the Great Furnace activated, all the machine giants started operating, and the factory was instantly buzzing with activity. Shan Yushin and the rest hurried to adjust the components during testing while Qin Mu executed his Overlord Body 3 elixir technique to circulate his vital qi. Other people first cultivated their spirit weapon before cultivating their primordial spirit after perfecting 6 directions realm. Furthermore, the primordial spirit wasn't perfect at that time as well. One would have to cultivate the celestial being realm for the primordial spirit to take shape and roam the universe. However, he had cultivated his primordial spirit before cultivating his spirit weapon. His primordial spirit was still very weak and had not been cultivated to the extent of taking shape. If it could take shape behind him, he would be a celestial being. However, between 6 directions and celestial being was 7 stars realm. He had just entered 6 directions realm and was far from that step. His primordial spirit roaming the world was only something that happened by chance. It was because he had met an expert like Xu Shenhua which had agitated his mind. Only because of it did he manage to enter comprehension beside the river and brought Ling Yuxia to roam the world. According to the traditional way of cultivating, he still needed to give birth to a spirit weapon with his 6 directions divine treasure. With the circulation of Overlord Body 3 elixir technique, Qin Mu felt his vital qi linking his spirit embryo, 5 elements, and 6 directions together. His soul and spirit embryo fused together and his primordial essence condensed, forming his primordial spirit. As he breathed in and out the nature of heaven and earth, his cultivation speed became much faster than before. Do other people cultivate like me? Based on the Crown Prince's words, it doesn't seem that way. He couldn't help feeling bewildered when he listened to Ling Yushu's words about how it was impossible for people to cultivate their primordial spirit at this stage. After cultivating primordial spirit, his cultivation speed was very fast, while if he didn't cultivate it, he would only stay with the normal routine. He temporarily placed his doubts aside and focused on executing Overlord Body 3 elixir technique. He guided the vital qi in his body and mobilized his qi and blood. In his 6 directions divine treasure, the primordial essences gathered and continuously flew into the center. At that place, a spirit weapon was gradually taking shape. Its shape born from 6 directions divine treasure was usually the most compatible with one's technique. This kind of spirit weapon was usually different from other spirit weapons as it breathed together and shared the same fate as its owner. It was a spirit weapon that grew together with the person. There was no need to even think about the shape of the spirit weapon. It naturally formed its shape as it accompanied the person's cultivation. While the spirit weapon was under construction, Qin Mu still couldn't see what shape it was going to take. He could only see a ball of light as his primordial essences came flying from all directions, gathering onto that ball of light. Faint markings of runes could be seen on the primordial essences, which was very mysterious. However, Qin Mu saw that these rune markings were nothing more than his techniques and skills. They were simply displayed in the form of runes. The 9 dragons of Ling Yuxiu and 1,000 silks of Sai Yunxiang also had these kinds of rune markings. When they were forged, these kinds of rune markings had to be imprinted on them to match well. The primordial essences flying towards the ball of light appeared as sword markings, so when the primordial essences flew toward the ball of light, it looked like flying swords were continuously flowing into the sword pellet. That sword pellet wasn't a pellet but a sword. It was refining dozens, no, more like hundreds or even thousands of swords into one. Therefore, the intrinsic quality of a sword pellet was still a sword. 6 directions divine treasure giving birth to a sword pellet spirit weapon was due to primordial essences with the form of flying swords rushing into the center. These primordial essences merged to form the shape of the pellet. The sword shapes were also called primordial swords. Only when every single one of them entered the pellet could one forge the sword pellet that belonged solely to oneself. Furthermore, the number of flying swords in the sword pellet had to match the number of primordial swords. Refining a sword pellet was the same as refining a sword until its form was even finer than a needle before turning it into the shape of a pellet. When refining a sword pellet, one would have to refine each and every single sword to the standard of being able to change their size at will. This point was very difficult. This was why the prices of sword pellets were high. Many divine arts practitioners usually used sword cases as a replacement. These could store much fewer flying stores. When refining them, bones of a beast with Dao-Tai bloodline were needed to increase the internal space, so in truth that they weren't that cheap either. Imperial College provided every imperial scholar with a sword case, so the empire's treasury also had to spend quite an amount of money every year. The imperial scholars that were truly rich would usually invite reputable masters and blacksmiths to forge a sword pellet for them as they were a symbol of status. So my spirit weapon is a sword pellet. Even though sword pellets are hard to make, it shouldn't be too difficult for me. Qin Mu had no real idea how valuable sword pellets were. After all, sword pellets were strewn everywhere around disabled elderly village. They were under Granny-sized bed, in her shoes, and were even eaten by some of the hens. What was even more terrifying was that Mute had an entire chest of sword pellets. It was filled to the brim and as heavy as a mountain. Qin Mu thought that it was hard work to refine a sword pellet, but since he had learned under Mute, he didn't believe that it'd be too much trouble. However, in his 6 directions divine treasure, primordial swords were still continuously entering the ball of light. Qin Mu calculated them and his face turned slightly green. The number of primordial swords that had entered the ball of light had already reached 5,000. This meant that he had to refine 5,000 flying swords to forge his own sword pellet. But that wasn't even worst of it. There were more primordial swords entering the ball of light, which meant that his future work was still increasing. Qin Mu wasn't worried about having no money to refine his sword pellet spirit weapon, though. He was never worried about money, but he was worried about the pellet being too heavy. Even if 1,000 flying swords were refined until they were extremely fine, their weight wouldn't change. If this many flying swords were added into a small pellet, its weight would be considerable. Eternal Peace Empire's flying swords were classified into 9 grades. The weight of the 9th grade one was 2 pounds, and this sword had the most inferior quality, having been forged using ordinary metal. These were weapons used by ordinary people, and even if they were all 9th grade swords, the finished sword pellet would be 10,000 pounds in weight. The bad news was that the better the flying sword was, the more it weighed. A 2nd grade flying sword would usually be 1,000 pounds. Only 1st grade flying swords, which belonged to first-ranking high officials, such as Qin Mu's Junior Protector Sword, were very light. Junior Protector Sword was made from the best materials in the world and forged by the best master of sword refinement. There were only over a dozen of them forged, and even if Qin Mu wanted to refine a sword pellet with such swords, he wouldn't have enough good materials to do so. 3rd grade swords are forged using winter iron essence and winter crystal iron. It's just that the weight would be too heavy. Even if I managed to refine them into a sword pellet, I wouldn't be able to use it. Just the sword pellet alone would exhaust me to death. As Qin Mu thought about this, his primordial swords finally stopped and no longer entered the ball of light. From the start to the end, there had been 8,000 swords. 8,000 swords, holy **T. Even if I'm rich, I'll still go bankrupt trying to make so many of them. Qin Mu was starting to feel a little terrified. But at that moment, he saw another type of primordial essences flying over and entering the ball of light. They were Buddhas that were coming from all directions. Wait a minute, isn't it a sword pellet? He was slightly stupefied. If his spirit weapon was a sword pellet, everything should have already been over. So why were there still Buddha-shaped primordial essences flying over? Other than them, there were also primordial knives. They entered the ball of light, followed by primordial Tao in the shapes of Wuji diagram, Taiji diagram, 4 symbols diagram, 5 elements diagram, and 8 trigrams. After that came all kinds of runes. There were insect markings, beast markings, and even dragon markings, as well as phoenix and bird markings. There were also god markings, devil markings, and even pictures of Yudu's words. In other words, a bit of everything. Qin Mu's green face started to turn slightly purple. Those pictures were there probably because there were too many things contained in his unity technique. There was Rulai's Mahayana Sutra, great educational heavenly devil scriptures, 9 dragons monarch technique, pig slaughter knife skills, and all kinds of other techniques, skills, and divine arts. Though in great educational heavenly devil scriptures alone there were many bizarre techniques and skills. Even the calculation methods from computational canon of supreme mystery were shown by his primordial essences, becoming a part of his spirit weapon's form. So many forms, what will my spirit weapon evolve into? Qin Mu was on tenterhooks. Could his sword pellet become a freak with all kinds of weapons? It was fine being a freak, but he was worried about how heavy it was going to end up after it was refined. How much money would he have to spend to refine it? After some more time, all of the primordial essences were in the ball of light, and its glow gradually dimmed. The form of the spirit weapon there slowly got clearer. Qin Mu was very scared and on edge, not daring to take a look. He was afraid that his spirit weapon had a form that was a spectacle too horrible to endure. Some time later, he finally mustered enough courage to look towards the spirit weapon in his 6 directions divine treasure and couldn't help freezing in shock. He saw that his spirit weapon still had the shape of a sword pellet and hadn't become abnormal. It wasn't like what he had imagined, which was a huge Buddha that had swords, knives, and all kinds of strange stuff stabbed into it. The sword pellet was still a sword pellet. It was just that every primordial sword had numerous markings on it. There were primordial Buddha markings, primordial Tao markings, primordial knife markings, bird, beast and insect markings, dragon and phoenix markings, god and devil markings, and writings of Yudu. Qin Mu sighed in relief. It's still okay, it's at most awfully heavy and not to the extent of crushing me. However, this sword pellet seems much bigger than other sword pellets. If I can refine a sword pellet that has the form of water like Grandpa Mute's, it should be slightly smaller. Shan Yushin and the rest spent numerous hours working busily for 2 days before finishing adjusting the components for a test. The manufacturing factory then began its operation. Qin Mu had also not slept the entire night just to condense the form of the spirit weapon, however, he had still ample vitality. He called Shan Yushin over and said, "The form of my spirit weapon is determined, but it's a little troublesome to refine. I require 8,000 sword embryos." 8,000 sword embryos? Shan Yushin was shocked and cried out, "Cult Master, 8,000 sword embryos would be enough to make a sect legacy treasure for a small sect. Is Cult Master sure he needs this many swords?" Qin Mu nodded and said helplessly, "The refinement of these 8,000 swords so they could change size at will before turning them into a sword pellet is giving me a great headache as well." Shan Yushin hesitated and said, 8,000 swords is enough to equip a small army. If you want to forge so many sword embryos, you'll require metals of the best quality. Before the natural disaster, I had sold some medicine and exchanged it for some money. Qin Mu thought of Hu Linger who had managed his finances and started to miss the little fox. He said, "I still have 1,000,000 great abundance coins here, I wonder if it'll be enough." Shan Yushin was shocked and smiled. "How can we spend Cult Master's money? We usually have the habit of collecting all kinds of natural materials and treasures. For example, there are people of our heavenly saint cult in the mines. When we dig out treasures, we usually don't hand them to the Empire, but hide them away in private." After looking around and seeing nobody around, he said in a low voice, "The rules of the sacred cult state to present the higher quality materials to the Emperor while bringing the highest quality ones to the treasure vault of our sacred cult." Qin Mu was startled. Shan Yushin smiled. The crafting of sacred cult master's spirit weapon is naturally a huge event, so you can mobilize all of the natural materials and treasures in the treasure vault of our sacred cult. As long as Cult Master gives the order to open the treasure vault, we Heavenly Crafts Hall will take out the treasures and refine 8,000 sword embryos for Cult Master. I don't dare to say how good the materials there will be, but they won't be much inferior to the materials used for the swords of the first-ranking high officials." Qin Mu let out a shaky breath and asked, "Where's the treasure vault?" Cult Master doesn't know where his treasure vault is. Shan Yushin didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It's naturally in Saint Arrival Mountain. The key to the treasure vault on Saint Arrival Mountain is kept by the Mistress of Sai family, which is also the saintess of our sacred cult, Shan Yushin said. The finances of our sacred cult are all managed by Sai family and all properties must go through their hands. If Cult Master wants to touch the treasure vault, you will have to fetch the key from the Saintess. As long as we take out the natural materials and treasures, refining 8,000 sword embryos won't be too difficult. It will actually be quite quick when using this factory. Sai family was a big family that had an illustrious position in Heavenly Devil cult, and the Saintess was usually from it. The Saintess of this generation was Sai Yunxiang, which meant that the key to the treasure vault was with her. Qin Mu found her, and his words astonished her. Sword pellet refined from 8,000 swords. Can Cult Master lift so many swords? Qin Mu's face blackened. He was also slightly worried that he wouldn't be able to carry a sword pellet made from so many flying swords. Sai Yunxiang took in his expression and chuckled. You're the Cult Master sacred teacher, so using the cult's materials and treasures to refine a spirit weapon is only natural. However, all of them had been accumulated by the disciples of the cult throughout a long time. By sending disaster relief, we had spent most of our money, so the treasury vault has no more money. If anything happened, it would be quite troublesome to deal with the problem without money. Qin Mu smiled. I know your troubles. I still have 1,000,000 great abundance coins here, so why don't I offer them to the sacred cult? You can also use them in times of trouble. Sai Yunxiang burst with joy and smiled. Even though 1,000,000 great abundance coins is a lot, with 1,000,000 disciples, everyone can only get 1 great abundance coins at most. Since Cult Master is refining a sword for himself, he will no longer need Junior Protector Sword. Qin Mu's face blackened, and he passed over his Junior Protector Sword to her. Sai Yunxiang then reminded him in goodwill, there's still some other treasures in Cult Master's Daotai sack, for example, 1,000 banners pagoda and some other stuff which could be used to refill the treasure vault. Qin Mu took his Daotai sack and pulled out 1,000 banners pagoda and the burnt Guqin. But suddenly, he was alerted and said, that's not right, I'm only refining a spirit weapon that's on the 6 directions realm, so why do you want my Cult Master level treasures? The worth is not the same. Saintess, are you trying to fool me? Sai Yunxiang sneered at him. Cult Master, the materials in the sacred cult's treasure vault are enough to refine dozens of treasures. Cult Master wants to use these treasures to refine a sword pellet, but he shouldn't leave the sacred cult's treasure vault empty just like that, right? Qin Mu gave it some thought, and it was indeed logical, so he could only give her all the Cult Master level treasures he had. All of them had been stolen from Roland's Golden Palace, so he wasn't too pained by losing them. Cult Master, you still have the star pearls that you scavenged from the shrine in the East Sea, right? Sai Yunxiang's eyes were shining. There were 3,000 of them. Qin Mu's face blackened as he said, Saintess, they are all I have left. Sai Yunxiang smiled. You're the sacred Cult Master, and I'm not taking those treasures of yours for myself, I'm just safekeeping them in the treasure vault of the sacred cult, so won't they still be yours? Our Sai family manages the finances, but isn't it that a tough job? We can only see but we cannot use, so no matter how much treasures we collect. Don't they all still belong to Qin? Qin Mu thought that what she said was very logical, but he still felt that something wasn't right. In the end though, he took out the 3,000 luminous pearls. Sai Yunxiang took a sneaky glance at his Daotai sack and said, there are also the 2 huge eyeballs. No way. Qin Mu's face turned black, and he had the urge to kill. Sai Yunxiang probed, that dragon Chilean of Cult Master. Qin Mu let out a sigh of relief and smiled. If you can raise him, you can take him away. Sai Yunxiang immediately laughed. I'm just joking, Cult Master. That glutton should remain with Cult Master. Even Patriarch doesn't want him, disliking him for eating too much. Let me go and find the elder of my Sai family to fetch the treasures from Saint Arrival Mountain to refine the swords for Cult Master. Qin Mu put away his empty Daotai sack with a black face. He felt that he was standing naked after being plundered by the little maiden. That woman is addicted to money, I can't win against her. I need to let Linga handle the finances, otherwise, I will be stripped naked and get my bone marrow sucked out by that saintess. Sacred Cult Master Qin thought to himself. Sai Yunxiang ran to the side and took out a mirror. It floated in the air and spun 2 rounds. Another mirror then appeared in the mirror, and behind it was an old woman who asked, "What is Saint Xiong looking for me?" Cai Yinxiang told her about how Qin Mu was going to refine his swords and said, "The spirit weapon that the sacred cult master is refining is no small matter. May Great-Grandma please take out the best quality materials in the treasure vault and send them to the manufacturing factory in Mill Prefecture." The old woman frowned and said, "Tsai family never does business that sustains a loss. Cult master is still young and his cultivation is still low, so why does he need the best quality treasures? It's a steal." Cai Yinxiang immediately showed all the treasures she had scammed from Qin Mu and made the eyes of the great-grandma of Tsai family shine brightly. So many treasures of the cult master level, Saint is sure has a way with housekeeping. Good, good, as expected of the one I've taught. You didn't learn from your aunt. Your aunt only knows how to splurge money like flowing water, but not how to calculate it, and is a wastrel. The one she meant was Granny Sai. She never cared about money and always bought what was expensive and not what was right. The great-grandma of Sai family said, "The best quality materials for refining swords are usually extremely heavy. A chunk that is the size of a thumb usually weighs dozens of pounds. Furthermore, we don't have enough materials in the treasure vault to refine 8,000 swords. To make treasures of the cult master level, it's enough to refine 27 swords, each one weighing around 10,000 pounds. What about a grade lower?" Cai Yinxiang asked. The great-grandma of Sai family said, "One grade lower is also not enough, it's at most enough for 100 swords." Cai Yinxiang frowned and asked, "Another grade lower?" Another grade lower would be winter iron essence, black gold essence, and black copper essence. They are more than enough to make 8,000 swords. Cai Yinxiang said, "Then could great-grandma please bring all the highest quality and a grade lower ones over, while using black gold essence for the rest to make up for the lack. The highest quality ones should be enough to open up the edge for the spirit swords." The great-grandma of Sai family asked suspiciously, "Winter iron essence is 3 times lighter than black gold essence, so why are you asking for it and not winter iron essence?" Cai Yinxiang smiled sweetly, and the great-grandma of Sai family rolled her eyes at her through the mirror. "You little wench, trying to be mischievous again, be careful of cult master smacking your bum sore when he can't lift it up. I'll send the items to Harmony Prefecture, so get the bandit with the surname Fan to drive his ship over." Cai Yinxiang acknowledged it and spun the bronze mirror 2 rounds in the opposite direction. The mirror in the mirror then vanished without a trace. After 2 days, Fen Yunxiao came from Harmony Prefecture, transporting all the materials Qin Mu needed to refine his swords. The manufacturing factory in Mill Prefecture immediately got busy again. It wasn't too much of a trouble to forge the sword embryos, as it was only shaping the metal into the initial shape of a sword, but even so, the sword embryos had to be refined up to 1,000 times, hammered and cast over and over again. After refining the sword embryos, the body of the sword would be a flat club. The grinding of it into the shape of the sword required Qin Mu to do it personally with hard work and numerous refinements. Qin Mu picked up one sword embryo, and his expression wasn't pleasant. Cai Yinxiang went up to act concerned. "Cult master, what's wrong?" "It's a little heavy," Qin Mu said resentfully. "It's 2 to 3 times heavier than what I imagined. Now that one sword is 300 pounds, after refining all of them into a sword pellet, 8,000 swords." Cai Yinxiang burst out laughing. Cult master wanted materials of the best quality, so they naturally are slightly heavier. The materials for the edge are better, heavier, sharper, and harder to forge than the treasured swords Emperor grants to his first-ranking officials. The so-called great crafts will need no skill. Cult master will just be able to throw his sword pellet over and you smash a whole bunch of people to death without any need for sword moves. Qin Mu's face went black as he said, "I will still need to be able to throw it, the 8,000 swords." Cai Yinxiang was overjoyed and said, "I've heard that when one refines an artifact to its maximum, its weight will change according to one's will. Cult master is an expert in refining treasures, so he will definitely refine the sword pellet to such a step." Qin Mu turned away while carrying the sword embryo and said some difficult-to-understand words. It was something like 100 creation, 100 forge, divine transformation technique, and power to remove mountains. Cai Yinxiang blinked and felt happy in her heart. In the factory, Shan Yushin wanted to stay to observe Qin Mu refining his sword, but Crown Prince Ling Yushu had to handle the government affairs in the other prefectures, so he could only order the disciples of Heavenly Crafts Hall to come and help. Meanwhile, he and the officials of Ministry of Works had to follow Ling Yushu to the next prefecture. With the disciples of Heavenly Crafts Hall helping, the speed of refinement wasn't slow. However, to forge all 8,000 swords to completely match the form of Qin Mu's spirit weapon was still a huge project. It was especially so because the natural materials Sai Yunxiang had transported were extremely good. It was quite exhausting to refine them until they could change their size at will. Qin Mu also had to continuously mark the spirit weapon and imprint all kinds of markings on the bodies of the swords. After a few months like this, he was a lot thinner from exhaustion. Ling Yuxiu and Sai Yunxiang had remained to help, and the two girls had learned numerous forging techniques from Qin Mu. They also added some high-quality materials to their 9 dragons and 1,000 silks, increasing their quality. Qin Mu finished refining 7,999 swords, which left only the last sword, the mother sword of the sword pellet. It had to be made from the best materials, or it wouldn't be able to unite all the child swords. To refine the mother sword, Qin Mu spent a lot of thought and effort. He had put aside the highest quality material for it, and this was a metal that he had never seen before. It was only the size of a fist, but such a chunk was already 10,000 pounds in weight. Sai Yunxiang said that it was an object that came from outer space. However, this chunk of metal was only enough to refine the blade and not the complete mother sword. Qin Mu took out the broken sword which came from Roland's Golden Palace. Sai Yunxiang had seen that it was only a fragment and so hadn't scammed it away from him. Qin Mu held the chunk of unknown metal in one hand and the broken sword in the other, waving them around. Suddenly, he heard a clang. The broken sword and the chunk of unknown metal actually attracted each other and collided. This was out of Qin Mu's expectations, and he saw the broken sword giving off a brilliant glow. Golden lights also flowed out from the fist-sized metal. It seemed like swords were flowing in the air, revolving in a large circle around Qin Mu, with him acting as the center. The dazzling radiance lighted up every corner of the manufacturing factory, and the brilliant rays also shot out from the doors and windows. Clanging sounds rang continuously, and Qin Mu saw the rays from the metal colliding with the glow of the broken sword. Each time that happened, his arm would go numb from the tremors. After countless collisions, the chunk of metal suddenly fell to the ground and scattered into ashes. Meanwhile, the broken sword in Qin Mu's hand was shining brilliantly. But how was it still a broken sword? It had actually absorbed the gold qi from that metal and grew out its blade, looking completely new. The body of the sword had strange markings that were wiggling about like dragons and snakes. Those markings lighted up and dimmed down right away, but Qin Mu still saw the word that was formed by those markings. Carefree. Carefree. Qin Mu's heart stirred slightly, but when he took a look at the markings on the sword again, he could no longer see the word carefree. It was as if the markings that were flowing earlier had been just a hallucination on his part. However, it wasn't a hallucination, the word carefree had really appeared. This sword that's called Carefree, is it related to Carefree Village? He sunk into deep thoughts. Could Carefree sword have come from Carefree Village? However, how did it become a broken sword? Why did this broken sword return back to normal when it met that chunk of unknown metal? All of this seemed to be destined by fate. It was destined that the broken Carefree sword would land in the hands of Roland's Golden Palace, and destined that Heavenly Saint Cult would get hold of that chunk of metal. It was destined that Qin Mu would steal the broken sword from Roland's Golden Palace, and destined that he would put it near that metal. It was destined for Carefree sword to return back to normal. When there's too much coincidence, it cannot be a coincidence anymore. Instead, there has to be a kind of power that could have facilitated this kind of coincidence. Sister Xiong, that chunk of metal is from outer space. When did it arrive? Qin Mu asked. Sai Yunxiang's mouth was agape, and she couldn't come back to her senses after being astonished by the turn of events for a time. When she calmed down though, she rolled her eyes at him. It's from outer space, but I'm not clear on when it had exactly arrived. I will have to get my great-grandma to check it out. Don't call me Sister Xiong. When you said it so affectionately, I feel like you are using sweet speech and honeyed words while thinking of getting rid of me in your heart. Qin Mu mumbled, in that case could Saintess help me check the origin of this chunk of metal? Sai Yunxiang took out her mirror and spun it 2 rounds. A mirror appeared in the mirror and the great-grandma of Sai family appeared on the other side. Sai Yunxiang made inquiries and the great-grandma of Sai family was astonished. Something like that actually happened? Give me a moment, let me check. Such a divine metal should have been recorded. Not long later, the great-grandma of Sai family came back with a book and said that divine metal came from outer space. It appeared 16 years ago. The record states that on the winter 16 years ago, divine light streaked across the sky and descended into Ghost Valley. Disciples of the cult went forth to investigate and found dozens of casualties. They picked up this chunk of divine metal there and offered it up to the treasure vault. 16 years ago. Qin Mu was slightly stunned. Since the time he had been picked up by Granny Sai, 15 years had passed, while this chunk of divine metal that repaired the broken sword had appeared in the winter 16 years ago. This was very close to when he was picked up. In that case, were there any people from Roland's Golden Palace in the surroundings then? Qin Mu asked hurriedly. The great-grandma of Sai family was bewildered and looked at him while asking, how did Cult Master know this? Ghost Valley is located at the back of the Ducktown zone that's in front of Qingmen Pass. Back then, the disciples of our sacred cult were guarding Qingmen Pass when the divine light flew down. The disciples of our sacred cult saw the light and immediately entered Ducktown zone. It borders barbarian Di Empire which had great shamans and shaman kings from Roland's Golden Palace on guard, so they also went forth to investigate. The sacred cult lost a hall master and dozens of divine arts practitioners while Roland's Golden Palace also lost a great deal of people. I've heard that the situation was quite bitter. They suffered disastrous damage and had no choice but to retreat from Ghost Valley. The great shamans and shaman kings of Roland's Golden Palace seemed to have gotten a broken sword. Qin Mu's heart was stirred. So that was it. The broken sword and divine metal were both from 16 years ago. Heavenly Devil Cult got the divine metal while Roland's Golden Palace got the broken sword. They were both actually one once, so when these two treasures were put together, they became complete. Great ruins Ghost Valley. I must definitely go there and have a look, he thought to himself. The great-grandma of Sai family said, the Ghost Valley in Ducktown Zone is very treacherous. The sacred cult had gone to search it a few more times but the place was ridden with dangers so they retreated without heading in deeper. Qin Mu thanked the old woman. Even though Sai Yunxiang was the saintess, the mistress of Sai family, this old woman was the one that was actually in charge of Sai family. She had an extremely high position in Heavenly Devil Cult, having once been a saintess, before giving up her position to Granny Sai. Sai Yunxiang put away her bronze mirror and took a glance at the sword in his hand. Great Cult Master, your sword. Qin Mu immediately tightened his grip on Carefree sword and said alertly, this is the mother sword of the sword pellet, I can't give it to you. Sai Yunxiang burst out laughing. I didn't say I wanted it, I just wonder if after you spent so much time and energy on this, if your sword pellet can be finished. Sword pellets have the word pellet which means a circular shape. Piecing several thousand swords together into a circular shape requires extremely great calculations. The arc of the bottom of the hilt has to be a circular ball that's split into 8,000 portions. Each portion will have to be exactly the same and must be accurate to the Mohu digits. Qin Mu was rather arrogant. My calculations have always been good. Ling Yuxiu and Sai Yunxiang pouted at him. Qin Mu laughed and tightened his grip on Carefree sword, sending his vital qi into it. Instantly, the mother sword and the child swords connected, sensing each other. The sharp swords whooshed through the air, and in a split second, sword lights filled the inside of the manufacturing factory. Qin Mu vibrated his sword, and countless of sword lights whizzed toward him. As they collided, they vanished one after another. Qin Mu's face became redder and redder as he grunted. His thighs and arms trembled. Suddenly, the stone slab under his feet cracked, and his shoes were crushed by the pressure. There were still countless sword lights flying over with a rumble when Qin Mu vanished. He had sunk into the ground from the pressure and created a huge hole in the manufacturing factory. Ling Yuxiu and Cai Yunxiang were both shocked. They immediately leaped forward and said in loud voices, "Come quickly and save the cult master." The other disciples of Heavenly Craft's hall that was in the manufacturing factory hurried over and heard rumblings from underground. The sword pellet was simply too heavy and was continuously pressing Qin Mu down into the ground. From the rumblings below, he had to have sunk close to 15 yards down by then. Everyone was planning to excavate a hole to save Qin Mu when his dull voice came from underground. "I'm okay, the sword is too heavy, everyone make way." Everyone immediately scattered when they saw countless flying swords spewing out from the huge hole as if it was a spring. 8,000 swords danced in the sky before stabbing themselves into the ground, making the sword hilts tremble endlessly. Qin Mu leaped out from the huge hole and landed on both his feet. However, his legs were still trembling and his complexion wasn't too good. He shook his sword once again, and countless flying swords came whooshing over. However, Qin Mu had learned his lesson and moved to stand on a pile of black iron chunks in the factory while pointing the tip of the sword down. The 8,000 swords merged together and formed a sword pellet. Just as he had said, the bottom of the sword hilts from so many swords could form a huge circular ball. It was perfect but for errors at the digits of Mo Hu. However, this sword pellet was unexpectedly big. It had a radius of 6 yards. "It's rare to see such a huge sword pellet," Ling Yuxiu couldn't help saying when she walked to and fro around the sword ball with her head raised to examine it. "Shrink!" Qin Mu executed his magic power, and the huge sword pellet began to shrink. When it shrunk to its limit, it still had the radius of 3 feet. Qin Mu's vital qi was already mobilized to his limits, and his face was red from holding his breath, but he still couldn't shrink it any more than that. His 8,000 flying swords were all able to shrink to an inch, but because there were too many swords, the sword pellet was still very big. "The time I used to refine them is too short, they still require more nourishment and refinement. If I could refine them until they are as fine as natural silk, I would be able to form a sword pellet that's the size of a pigeon egg." Qin Mu let out a shaky breath and gripped the sword hilt of Carefree Sword with both of his hands. With a sudden spin, the 7,999 swords instantly expanded outwards. They hung in the air with the tips of the swords pointing to the center of the circle. He activated Carefree Sword again, and the flying swords flew over and collided with it with a hum before vanishing into the mother sword. The collisions became faster and faster as more and more flying swords disappeared from the air. Everyone gave a cry of astonishment. Qin Mu was now using another refinement method for a sword pellet. There were 2 methods to make a sword pellet. The first was to piece all of them into a pellet with the tip of the sword facing the center of the circlet. This refinement method had a high requirement for algebra, and many sword sects from Dao sects factions used this kind of method to refine their sword pellets. The second kind was to use the mother sword to swallow the child swords. Keeping all the child swords in the mother sword was the refinement method used mostly by the sword sects of the south. The second variant required the mother sword to be extremely flexible. After entering all the child swords inside, the 2 hands would just have to rub the body of the mother sword and it would turn into a sword pellet. This didn't need a high requirement for algebra. Both methods had their own advantages. Sword pellets made by the first method had an easier time executing sword skills and was quicker in making a move, laying out sword formations at any time. The second method of swallowing swords could direct the power of the child swords to the mother sword, allowing it to explode with abnormally powerful strength. These 2 refinement methods were not flexible. It was either one or the other. But at that moment, Qin Mu had tried to accommodate both methods, and he actually succeeded. It was truly extraordinary. A well-deserved reputation of the world's number 2 in refining weapons. Cai Yunxiang sighed. "How I wish I could witness how the number 1 expert in the world refines weapons. How brilliant must his techniques be." Qin Mu had collected over 2,000 swords when he started to feel that he couldn't bear the weight anymore. After operating so many swords repeatedly, his vital qi was completely emptied out. He stopped holding onto the swords and shook his Dao Tai sack. Countless flying swords immediately flew over like fish and went inside. Even though his sword pellet was done, the only thing he could only use his Doutai sack as a storage bag since the sword's weight was simply too great. A sword pellet that had a radius of 3 feet was just too shocking, and he wouldn't be able to lift it either. I was originally a little envious of the cowherd sword pellet, but now I don't feel anything of the kind, Ling Yuxiu said in a low voice while holding back her laughter. Even though his spirit weapon is good, he won't be able to use it. Cai Yunxiang nodded. Even if he could lift them, his vital qi will be gone after a few swings. Qin Mu hung the Doutai sack back on his pants. However, even though Doutai sacks were said to be able to dismiss magnetic forces, his was not made from a real Doutai skin. Because of that, some of the magnetic forces still affected the flying swords. The Doutai sack came to weigh 100 pounds and dragged his pants down. Great Cult Master Qin undid the Doutai sack with a black face and fetched some golden thread rope to make 2 straps to the Doutai sack. This allowed him to carry it on his back like a small backpack. Piak! A clear smacking sound rang out, and Cai Yunxiang's face turned red as she rubbed her buttocks. Qin Mu had given a tight slap to her behind when no one looking. The great cult master knew she had played some trick on the materials used for refining the swords to make them so heavy. Ling Yuxiu looked over in bewilderment but didn't ask anything. She said, "My brother has already been gone for a few months, so I'm afraid that he has already reached the southern borders. Are we still going to hurry over?" Qin Mu shook his head. "I'm not going to find the crown prince. Qingmen Pass is right to the north of Great Thunderclap Monastery and is not far from here, so I will visit Ghost Valley. This video will end here.